Madeline Carter never imagined working for someone like Richard Armitage. The moment she stepped into the glass-walled office of Armitage Capital, she was struck by the overwhelming sense of power and ambition. It clung to the air like static electricity, leaving no room for anything warm or humane. Richard himself embodied that atmosphere. He was tall, with an imposing figure, silver-threaded hair that was always impeccably styled, and sharp gray eyes that seemed to cut through people like they were financial reports to be audited. As CEO, Richard was a man who demanded absolute loyalty and perfection from his employees. His reputation was built on his ability to crush competitors and bend markets to his will. The same ruthless efficiency applied to his staff. Mistakes were not tolerated. Hesitations were met with his signature glare, a look that left even the most confident executives faltering. The office whispered tales of junior associates reduced to tears in the privacy of the restrooms after a brief meeting with Richard. Madeline, however, had quickly learned to navigate this treacherous environment. In just over a year as Richard's administrative assistant, she had become indispensable. She organized his life down to the minute, anticipated his needs before he voiced them, and ensured he never had to deal with inconveniences. To him she was an extension of his will, a tool he used to maintain his relentless schedule. To everyone else, Madeline was the polished professional, always poised and prepared. She dressed the part. Sleek pencil skirts, tailored blouses, and low heels that gave her just enough height to match the aura of confidence she projected. Her chestnut brown hair was always neatly tied back, and her makeup understated but flawless. Beneath that exterior, however, was a different story. Madeline had grown adept at hiding her true feelings. Beneath her calm facade, she despised the cold, transactional world she had stepped into. The rigid corporate hierarchy, the never-ending pressure, and Richard's unyielding presence gnawed at her spirit. She hated the way her co-workers glanced nervously over their shoulders every time Richard passed by, how their lives revolved around his moods and demands. Yet she stayed. Her efficiency and intelligence had carried her far, and in a city as unforgiving as New York, she couldn't afford to throw it all away. What she hadn't expected was Evelyn. The day Evelyn Armitage walked into the office, everything changed. It was an unassuming Tuesday morning when Madeline first saw her. Evelyn arrived unannounced, carrying a small, gift-wrapped package. She breezed past the reception desk with a smile that seemed to brighten the sterile white and gray decor of the office. Evelyn's vibrant red hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her emerald green dress clung to her figure just enough to hint at the curves beneath. Her presence was magnetic, the kind that drew eyes without even trying. "Good morning," Evelyn said warmly as she approached Madeline's desk. Her voice was soft but carried a hint of something deeper, a confidence that wasn't overbearing but entirely captivating. "Good morning," Madeline replied, her professionalism kicking in despite the sudden racing of her pulse. "How can I help you?" "I'm Evelyn," she said, extending a hand. "Evelyn Armitage, Richard's wife." Madeline's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly masked her surprise. She took Evelyn's hand, noting how warm it felt compared to her own cool fingers. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Armitage," Madeline said. "Please call me Evelyn," she replied with a smile that was disarmingly genuine. "I just stopped by to drop this off for Richard. It's his anniversary gift." Madeline couldn't help but glance at the package. It was elegantly wrapped, the kind of detail that spoke of thoughtfulness and care. For a brief moment she wondered what it must be like to be married to someone like Richard. She imagined it was a life of luxury and appearances, but also one of isolation. "I'll make sure he gets it," Madeline said, her voice steady despite the strange warmth building in her chest. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze lingering on Madeline for a fraction too long. When their eyes met, it felt as though the air had shifted. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither could name but both felt acutely. It was a fleeting moment, but it left Madeline unsettled. "Thank you," Evelyn said at last, her smile returning. "It was nice meeting you, Madeline." As she walked away, Madeline found herself unable to look away. The way Evelyn moved, the effortless grace with which she carried herself, was mesmerizing. For the rest of the day she struggled to focus. Evelyn's image lingered in her mind. The vibrant hair, the kind smile, and the warmth that had seemed to pierce through the coldness of the office. In the days that followed, Madeline couldn't stop thinking about her. At first she tried to dismiss it as a passing curiosity. Evelyn was beautiful, yes, but there was more to it. There was a depth to her that intrigued Madeline, a contrast to the icy world she lived in. She found herself replaying their brief interaction in her mind, dissecting every word, every glance. She knew it was dangerous. Evelyn was married, and not just to anyone but to Richard. The very thought of being caught in any kind of inappropriate situation with his wife was unthinkable. Yet no matter how much she tried to push it aside, the feelings persisted. Evelyn began to feel like an obsession. Madeline would catch herself daydreaming about what Evelyn's life might be like outside of the office. Did she spend her days shopping on Fifth Avenue? Did she throw elaborate dinner parties for Richard's colleagues? Or was there something else entirely, a life hidden beneath the polished surface? Madeline knew she was treading dangerous ground, but she couldn't help herself. Evelyn wasn't just beautiful, she was a mystery, one that Madeline couldn't resist wanting to unravel. The shift in Madeline's life began on an otherwise uneventful morning, marked only by the steady hum of the office and the muted clicks of keyboards. She was seated at her desk, scanning through Richard Armitage's packed schedule for the day, when the sharp sound of high heels against the polished marble floor caught her attention. She glanced up, expecting to see one of the senior associates rushing to meet a deadline, but instead her breath hitched. The woman who had entered the office seemed to bring the world around her to a halt. She was stunning, with waves of rich, coppery red hair cascading over her shoulders and a complexion that radiated elegance. She wore a deep emerald green dress that hugged her figure in all the right places, paired with understated but expensive heels. What struck Madeline most, however, was her smile. It wasn't just polite or practiced. It was warm, radiant, the kind of smile that made the cold, impersonal office feel alive for the first time. Madeline barely had a moment to process what she was seeing before the woman's eyes found hers. For an instant the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Evelyn's gaze was soft yet piercing, an unexpected blend of curiosity and something deeper, something that Madeline couldn't quite name but felt acutely. It was as if Evelyn could see through the layers of professionalism and self-control Madeline had so carefully constructed. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice smooth and melodic. Madeline swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Good morning. How can I help you?" The woman stepped closer, and Madeline noticed the faint scent of jasmine and vanilla that followed her, subtle but intoxicating. "I'm Evelyn Armitage," she said, her tone light but with a quiet confidence. "Richard's wife." Madeline blinked, caught off guard. She had heard about Evelyn in passing, whispers in the break room about her beauty, the way she seemed so different from her husband. But no description had prepared her for the reality. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Armitage," Madeline replied, her voice steady despite the sudden quickening of her heartbeat. "Please," Evelyn said with a smile that sent a small shiver down Madeline's spine. "Just call me Evelyn." Madeline nodded, her professionalism keeping her grounded even as her mind raced. Evelyn held out a small, meticulously wrapped box, its gold ribbon gleaming under the office's sterile lighting. "I just came by to drop this off for Richard," Evelyn explained. "It's for our anniversary. He asked me to bring it in since he forgot it this morning." Madeline took the box carefully, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. The touch was so fleeting it could have been accidental, but the spark it ignited was anything but. Madeline's stomach fluttered and she felt an unfamiliar heat creep up her neck. "Of course," Madeline said, clutching the box tightly as if it were an anchor. "I'll make sure he gets it." Evelyn's gaze lingered on her, and for a heartbeat too long neither of them moved. There was a weight in the air, a quiet tension that neither seemed willing or able to break. "Thank you, Madeline," Evelyn said finally, her voice softer now, almost intimate. Her lips curved into a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Madeline felt a pang of something she couldn't explain. As Evelyn turned and walked away, Madeline found herself unable to look anywhere else. The gentle sway of her movements, the confidence in her stride, the way she seemed to make even the cold fluorescent lights above seem warmer, it all stayed with her long after Evelyn disappeared from view. Madeline sat back in her chair, the box still in her hands, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her pulse was racing, her thoughts a jumbled mess. What was that? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the intensity of the moment as nothing more than an overreaction. Evelyn was married, and to Richard no less. She was untouchable. And yet, as Madeline returned to her work, she couldn't shake the image of Evelyn's eyes, the way they had seemed to see her in a way no one else ever had. It was unsettling but also thrilling. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Madeline went through the motions of her duties, replying to emails, coordinating meetings and fielding phone calls, but her mind kept wandering back to Evelyn. Every detail of their brief encounter played over and over in her mind. The warmth of Evelyn's voice, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her smile had felt like a secret meant just for Madeline. By the time the office emptied and the city lights began to twinkle outside the towering windows, Madeline was exhausted, not from her work, but from the whirlwind of emotions she couldn't seem to escape. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a single moment, that there was nothing to it, but the truth lingered in the back of her mind. Something had shifted in her and she didn't know how to make it stop. In the days that followed, Madeline found herself consumed by thoughts of Evelyn. It was almost maddening, the way Evelyn's presence lingered in her mind, refusing to fade no matter how much she tried to push it aside. She caught herself replaying their brief interaction over and over again. Evelyn's smile, her soft yet confident voice, the way her emerald eyes seemed to sparkle with something unspoken. It wasn't just her beauty, though Evelyn was undoubtedly breathtaking. It was something deeper, something intangible that set her apart. Evelyn radiated warmth in a way Madeline hadn't experienced in years. In a world as cold and ruthless as Armitage Capital, where success was measured in dollars and loyalty was bought rather than earned, Evelyn seemed like a beacon of humanity. Her mere existence was a stark contrast to the icy, domineering presence of her husband. Where Richard's energy demanded submission, Evelyn's offered solace. It was a dynamic that Madeline couldn't stop thinking about, even though she knew how dangerous it was to dwell on such thoughts. At first, Madeline tried to rationalize her obsession. Of course, Evelyn had caught her attention. She was the wife of the man who essentially controlled her life. But it wasn't just that. There was something about the way Evelyn had looked at her, the way her gaze had lingered just a fraction too long, as if she had seen beyond the mask of professionalism Madeline wore every day. The smallest details became magnified in Madeline's mind. She imagined the way Evelyn's fingers had brushed against the wrapped box she'd brought for Richard, her movements graceful yet unassuming. She pictured Evelyn sipping coffee, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of the cup as if savoring the warmth. Even the sound of her voice haunted Madeline, the gentle lilt, the quiet strength behind her words. At night, when the city lights painted her apartment walls with flickering shadows, Madeline would lie awake, replaying the sound of Evelyn saying her name. Madeline. It had been so simple, so casual, yet it had ignited something in her. She hated how easily it crept into her thoughts, how it made her chest tighten with a longing she didn't dare put into words. Evelyn wasn't just unattainable, she was forbidden. She belonged to Richard, and Richard was not the kind of man one crossed lightly. Madeline knew this all too well. He was meticulous, always watching, always calculating. To even entertain the idea of Evelyn as anything more than a passing thought was reckless. But despite her better judgment, Madeline couldn't help herself. She started noticing little things about Evelyn's life, piecing together fragments from office gossip and her own observations. Evelyn rarely made appearances at the office, and when she did, it was always for brief, business-like visits. Yet even in those short moments, Madeline couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Evelyn's story. She began to wonder what it must be like to live in Evelyn's world. A life of luxury and privilege, but also one that seemed suffocatingly lonely. Madeline had seen glimpses of that loneliness in Evelyn's eyes. It was subtle, buried beneath her practiced smiles and graceful demeanor, but it was there. Evelyn's marriage to Richard, Madeline imagined, was more about maintaining appearances than genuine affection. Richard was a man obsessed with control and image, and Evelyn, beautiful and poised, was the perfect complement to his power-hungry ambitions. The thought made Madeline's chest ache. She hated the idea of someone like Evelyn, so full of life, so radiant, being trapped in a marriage that seemed devoid of love. It felt unjust, cruel even, though she knew it wasn't her place to feel such things. Evelyn wasn't hers to worry about. And yet, no matter how much Madeline tried to convince herself that these thoughts were futile, they only grew stronger. Every time she passed by Richard's office and saw Evelyn's anniversary gift sitting untouched on his desk, a small pang of resentment flared in her. How could he be so indifferent to someone like her? One afternoon, as Madeline sat at her desk typing up a memo, her phone buzzed with a new email. She glanced at the screen, expecting another mundane task, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw the sender. Evelyn Armitage. For a moment she simply stared at the name, her pulse quickening. What could Evelyn possibly want? With trembling fingers she opened the message. Subject: thank you. Message: Hi Madeline. I just wanted to thank you again for your help the other day. I hope I wasn't too much of a bother. It's rare that I find someone as kind and attentive as you in Richard's world. Warm regards, Evelyn. Madeline read the email twice, her heart thudding in her chest. The words were simple, polite, but there was something about them that felt personal. It wasn't just a courtesy email. Evelyn had taken the time to write this, and the way she'd phrased it, kind and attentive, felt like more than just a compliment. Madeline's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. What could she possibly say in response? She didn't want to read too much into the email, but the warmth in Evelyn's words was undeniable. Finally, she typed a short reply, keeping her tone professional but genuine. Reply: Hi Evelyn. It was absolutely no trouble at all. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything else I can do for you. Best, Madeline. As soon as she hit send, a wave of nerves washed over her. She felt ridiculous for overthinking such a small interaction, but there was no denying the excitement that bubbled beneath her anxiety. It was a dangerous game she was playing and she knew it. But for the first time in a long while, Madeline felt alive. The days dragged on, each one filled with the monotony of corporate life, but Evelyn's email remained in the back of Madeline's mind, a spark of warmth in her otherwise cold world. She didn't know what would come of it, if anything at all. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had begun to shift, a quiet inevitability pulling her closer to Evelyn with every passing day. The gala was one of those extravagant events that seemed designed to flaunt wealth and power. Hosted in the grand ballroom of an upscale Manhattan hotel, the room was a sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in warm, golden light, and soft classical music played in the background, mingling with the hum of polite conversation. The event was as much a performance as it was a celebration, a chance for Richard Armitage and his company to reinforce their dominance in the financial world. Madeline Carter arrived early, dressed in a sleek black gown that she had agonized over for weeks. It was simple but elegant, clinging to her form in a way that felt both powerful and vulnerable. She had spent the day mentally preparing herself for an evening of navigating Richard's world, where every conversation felt like a power play and every smile carried an ulterior motive. But as she stepped into the ballroom, her thoughts immediately turned to Evelyn. Would she be here? The question buzzed in her mind, refusing to leave her alone. She scanned the room subtly as she greeted familiar faces, her heart sinking when she didn't see Evelyn anywhere. But then, just as she was beginning to tell herself to let it go, a ripple of movement caught her eye near the entrance. Evelyn had arrived. She was stunning, a vision in a deep crimson dress that flowed like liquid silk as she walked. Her hair was pinned up in an intricate style with a few soft strands framing her face. She exuded an effortless grace that made heads turn as she moved through the crowd, smiling and exchanging polite greetings. But when her gaze landed on Madeline, something changed. Evelyn's smile softened, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the crowded ballroom had disappeared, leaving only the two of them. Madeline's breath hitched, her pulse quickening as Evelyn began to make her way toward her. She felt a rush of panic, excitement, and something else she couldn't name. She knew this was dangerous, knew she should keep her distance, but as Evelyn approached, it was as if her feet were rooted to the floor. Madeline, Evelyn said warmly, her voice cutting through the noise around them. You look stunning tonight. Madeline blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. Thank you. You look incredible. Evelyn smiled, a touch of amusement in her eyes at Madeline's stammering. I wasn't sure I'd see you here. Events like this come with the job, Madeline said, trying to keep her tone light despite the way her heart was racing. And you? Oh, Richard insisted, Evelyn said, her smile dimming just slightly. You know how these things are. Appearances and all that. The way Evelyn's voice dipped at the mention of Richard sent a pang through Madeline. There it was again, that glimpse of something fragile beneath Evelyn's perfect exterior. Before Madeline could stop herself, she said, I imagine it must get exhausting. Evelyn's gaze flickered, and for a moment, Madeline worried she had overstepped. But then Evelyn let out a soft laugh, her shoulders relaxing. Exhausting doesn't even begin to cover it. The two of them moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the main crowd. Madeline couldn't help but feel the intensity of Evelyn's presence, the way every small movement, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, tilting her head slightly as she listened, seemed to draw Madeline in further. They fell into an easy conversation talking about everything from the decor of the ballroom to the absurdity of corporate galas. As the minutes passed, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Madeline felt herself relaxing, the tension of the evening melting away in Evelyn's company. But then, just as she began to feel a dangerous sense of comfort, Evelyn's tone shifted. "You know," Evelyn said quietly, her eyes drifting to the glass of champagne in her hand, "these events are always a stark reminder of how lonely my life has become." Madeline's chest tightened. She hadn't expected Evelyn to be so open, so vulnerable. She hesitated, unsure of what to say, but Evelyn continued before she could respond. "Richard and our marriage isn't what people think it is." Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was a heaviness to her words, as though she were carrying a burden she had kept hidden for too long. "We're not partners. We're more like two actors playing roles in a very public play." Madeline's heart ached at the sadness in Evelyn's eyes. She wanted to reach out to offer some kind of comfort, but she forced herself to stay still. This was dangerous territory. "I'm sorry," Madeline said softly. "That sounds incredibly difficult." Evelyn's gaze lifted, meeting Madeline's. "It is. But sometimes I wonder if it's even worth fighting anymore." There was a pause, a charged silence that seemed to stretch endlessly between them. Madeline felt her own walls beginning to crack, the part of her that had been trying so hard to keep her feelings at bay faltering in the face of Evelyn's honesty. "Evelyn," Madeline began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you deserve so much more than this. More than pretending." The words hung in the air like a confession, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Evelyn took a small step closer, her green eyes searching Madeline's face. "Do you really think so?" "Yes," Madeline said, her voice trembling but firm. "I do." The tension between them was palpable, a magnetic pull that neither seemed able or willing to resist. Madeline's pulse pounded in her ears as Evelyn's hand brushed against hers, the faintest touch, but enough to send a jolt through her entire body. "I shouldn't be telling you this," Evelyn murmured, her voice laced with both fear and longing. "But I feel like I can't breathe anymore. Like I'm suffocating in this life." Madeline's heart broke at the raw vulnerability in Evelyn's voice. She wanted to say something, to tell Evelyn that she wasn't alone, that she would do anything to help her escape the pain she was feeling. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, all she could do was reach out, her fingers lightly brushing against Evelyn's. It was such a small gesture, but the way Evelyn's breath hitched told Madeline it meant everything. The moment felt fragile, like a thread stretched to its breaking point. And in that instant Madeline knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. The storm began on a Wednesday night, the kind of evening where the city's lights were muted by sheets of rain and the steady drum of water against windows filled the air. Madeline had just finished another grueling day at the office when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from Evelyn. "Madeline, I hate to bother you so late, but Richard forgot some documents he needs for tomorrow's meeting. Would you mind bringing them by? I'd really appreciate it." Her heart thudded in her chest as she read the words. Logic screamed at her to say no, to come up with an excuse, but the part of her that had been yearning for Evelyn since the gala couldn't resist. She typed out a quick reply before she could overthink it. "Of course. I'll be there shortly." The drive to the Armitage penthouse was a blur. Rain slicked the streets, and the wipers beat furiously against the windshield as Madeline tried to steady her breathing. Her thoughts swirled with equal parts excitement and dread. What was she doing? She knew this wasn't just about the documents. Evelyn could have sent someone else. She could have waited for Richard. But she hadn't. She'd chosen Madeline. When she arrived, the building loomed above her, its facade shimmering with reflected light. The doorman waved her in, clearly accustomed to visitors for the Armitages, and within minutes she was stepping out of the private elevator and into the grand expanse of their home. The penthouse was exactly what she had imagined. Sprawling, modern, and cold. The walls were pristine white, adorned with abstract art that seemed chosen more for its price tag than for any personal connection. The furniture was sleek, angular, and expensive, every piece carefully curated to project wealth and power. But the space felt empty, devoid of warmth, as though no one truly lived there. Evelyn was the exception. The door opened and there she stood, barefoot in a pair of faded jeans and a loose, light gray blouse. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun and her face was free of makeup. For the first time, Madeline saw Evelyn not as the elegant, polished wife of Richard Armitage, but as a woman. A beautiful, vulnerable, breathtakingly real woman. "Madeline," Evelyn said, her smile soft and genuine. "Thank you for coming. I hope I didn't drag you out in this storm for nothing." Madeline managed a smile, though her voice caught in her throat. "It's no trouble at all." Evelyn stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. As Madeline entered, she felt the warmth of the space Evelyn seemed to create just by being there. It was subtle, but it transformed the sterile penthouse into something almost welcoming. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, and the soft glow of a single lamp in the corner gave the room a touch of intimacy. "I made some tea," Evelyn said, her voice casual but tinged with an undercurrent of something more. "I thought you might like some before you head back out into that rain." Madeline hesitated, the polite refusal on the tip of her tongue, but the look in Evelyn's eyes stopped her. It wasn't just an offer. It was an invitation. "Tea sounds great," she said finally. Evelyn led her into the kitchen where 2 steaming mugs sat on the marble counter. Madeline couldn't help but notice the small touches. How Evelyn's fingers lingered on the handle of her mug, how she tilted her head slightly as she spoke, the way her laughter was soft but genuine when she commented on the ridiculousness of the storm outside. For a while they talked about everything except the documents. Evelyn told stories about her childhood, her voice growing wistful as she described summers spent on her grandparents' farm in upstate New York. Madeline found herself sharing more than she intended, opening up about her own struggles, her loneliness in a city that often felt as cold and unfeeling as Richard's office. The conversation ebbed and flowed, and with each passing moment the tension between them grew. It was an unspoken thing, a quiet pull that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Madeline could feel her pulse quickening every time Evelyn's eyes lingered on hers a little too long or their fingers brushed as they reached for their mugs. At some point the conversation turned serious. Evelyn's gaze dropped to her tea, her voice growing quieter. "Richard doesn't really live here, you know," she said. "He exists here but he doesn't live. Not in any real sense." Madeline's heart ached at the sadness in Evelyn's tone. "Evelyn." Evelyn looked up, her green eyes filled with a vulnerability that took Madeline's breath away. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said with a small, bitter laugh. "Maybe because you actually listen. You're probably the first person in years who's really listened." "I want to listen," Madeline said softly. "If you need someone." Their eyes met, and the silence that followed was deafening. Madeline felt the air between them grow heavy, charged with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against Madeline's arm. The touch was so gentle, so fleeting, but it sent a shockwave through Madeline's entire being. "Madeline," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm trapped. Like I've been trapped for so long I don't even remember what it feels like to be free." Madeline's heart broke at the raw emotion in Evelyn's voice. Without thinking she reached out, her hand covering Evelyn's. "You're not alone," she said, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to well in her eyes. "You don't have to go through this alone." Evelyn's eyes searched hers and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the windows, but inside it was quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the city below and the pounding of Madeline's heart. And then it happened. Evelyn leaned in, her lips brushing against Madeline's in a kiss so soft it felt like a whisper. Madeline froze, her mind racing with 1,000 reasons why this was a mistake, why she should pull away, but her body refused to listen. Instead she leaned into the kiss, her hands finding Evelyn's waist as the world around them faded away. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their faces inches apart. "I shouldn't have done that," Evelyn said, her voice shaky. But she didn't move away. Her hands stayed on Madeline's arms, her eyes locked on hers. Madeline shook her head. "Evelyn." The sound of Evelyn's phone vibrating on the counter shattered the moment. They both jumped, the spell between them broken. Evelyn glanced at the screen, her face paling. "It's Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Madeline felt a surge of panic. You should answer it. Evelyn nodded, her hand trembling as she picked up the phone. Madeline stepped back, her heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Nothing would ever be the same again. As the storm outside raged on, the soft sound of rain against the penthouse windows became an almost soothing backdrop to the quiet atmosphere inside. Madeline sat across the sleek marble kitchen island from Evelyn, the documents Richard had forgotten spread out between them. Evelyn, now more relaxed in her faded jeans and loose blouse, studied the papers with a furrowed brow, a pen twirling absently in her fingers. At first their conversation was strictly about the work. Evelyn asked polite questions, her tone professional, as they reviewed the logistics Richard needed for his upcoming trip. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the formality began to ebb away, replaced by something warmer, more personal. I always hated this part, Evelyn admitted with a small, self-deprecating laugh, gesturing to the papers. The endless details, the calculations. Richard thrives on it, of course. For him, numbers are everything. Madeline glanced up, caught by the edge of vulnerability in Evelyn's voice. I can imagine. He's precise. Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes distant. Precise is one word for it. Madeline hesitated, sensing that Evelyn was on the verge of saying more. She didn't push. Something told her Evelyn wasn't used to being truly heard. Instead she waited, giving Evelyn the space to speak. After a moment, Evelyn sighed, setting the pen down. You know, I never planned for my life to be like this. She looked up, meeting Madeline's gaze. Marrying Richard, living this carefully curated existence. It sort of happened. One decision led to another, and before I knew it, I was here. In this gilded cage. Madeline's heart ached at the raw honesty in Evelyn's voice. A cage, she repeated softly. That's how it feels. Evelyn nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. It's beautiful, isn't it? The penthouse, the lifestyle, the image. From the outside it looks perfect. But on the inside, her voice trailed off and she shook her head. It's empty. Lonely. Sometimes I feel like I've forgotten what it's like to really live. Madeline swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She didn't know what to say. How could she? Evelyn's pain was so palpable, so profound, that it left her feeling both helpless and fiercely protective. I'm sorry, Madeline said finally, her voice quiet but earnest. You don't deserve to feel that way. Evelyn's eyes softened, and for a moment she just looked at Madeline, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a soft, bitter laugh. You're kind to say that. But kindness is such a rarity in my world. It almost feels foreign. Madeline hesitated, then decided to take a risk. You deserve more than kindness. You deserve freedom. Happiness. Evelyn's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly as if the words had struck a chord. Freedom, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't felt that in years. The confession hung between them like a fragile thread. Madeline felt the weight of Evelyn's gaze, and something inside her shifted. It wasn't just sympathy or even admiration. It was a connection, deep and undeniable, as if the space between them had vanished, leaving their souls exposed. Without thinking, Madeline spoke. You're not the only one who feels trapped. Evelyn tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? Madeline hesitated, the vulnerability of the moment terrifying but also liberating. I mean, I've spent so much of my life trying to be perfect. Trying to be what everyone else needs me to be. Efficient. Reliable. Unflappable. She looked down, her voice growing softer. But it's lonely. Exhausting even. And sometimes I wonder if this is all there is. If I'll ever feel seen. Evelyn reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against Madeline's arm. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through Madeline's entire body. She looked up, startled, and found Evelyn's gaze fixed on hers, intense and searching. You are seen, Madeline, Evelyn said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. You are. The words hit Madeline like a wave, washing over her and leaving her breathless. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to the depth of feeling in Evelyn's voice. All she could do was hold Evelyn's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment stretched on, the tension between them growing thicker with each passing second. Madeline felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them, the rain outside a distant memory. Evelyn's hand lingered on her arm, her touch warm and grounding, yet electrifying at the same time. "Evelyn," Madeline whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know what she was going to say, only that she couldn't look away, couldn't break the spell between them. Evelyn's lips parted, her breath hitching. "Madeline." Her name on Evelyn's lips was almost too much. Madeline felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her crumbling. She knew this was dangerous, knew the consequences of crossing this line, but the pull was irresistible. The sound of a loud clap of thunder broke the moment, making both of them jump. Evelyn pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing as she looked away. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize," Madeline interrupted, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "Please don't." Evelyn looked back at her, a mixture of relief and uncertainty in her eyes. "This is complicated." Madeline nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "That's one word for it." For a moment Evelyn laughed, a real, genuine laugh that lit up her face and made Madeline's heart ache in the best way. But then the laughter faded and the weight of reality settled back over them. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe again." Madeline's chest tightened, the words cutting through her like a blade. She wanted to say something, anything, to ease Evelyn's pain, but she knew that no words could do justice to the depth of what she was feeling. So instead she reached out, her hand brushing against Evelyn's. It was a small gesture, but it carried more meaning than she could ever put into words. The storm outside raged on, but inside, in that quiet moment between them, it felt as though the world had stilled. The moment was inevitable, like the tension in a storm building until the air was too thick to breathe. Madeline knew she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross, but the pull of Evelyn was too strong to resist. The world around them faded. The storm outside, the sterile coldness of the penthouse, even the documents scattered across the counter. All that remained was Evelyn. The warmth of her touch, the vulnerability in her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as if waiting for something to happen. It was Madeline who moved first, though she wasn't sure if it was a conscious choice or instinct. She leaned forward, her breath catching as the space between them disappeared. Evelyn met her halfway, and their lips brushed together in a kiss so soft, so tentative, it felt like it might shatter if they weren't careful. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough to spark something inside them both, a heat that spread through Madeline's body like wildfire. She pulled back abruptly, her eyes wide with panic as reality came crashing down around her. "Oh God," Madeline whispered, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have." Evelyn reached for her, her fingers closing around Madeline's hand with a firmness that stopped her in her tracks. "Don't," Evelyn said, her voice low but steady. "Don't apologize." Madeline looked at her, torn between fear and desire. "Evelyn, this is..." "Madeline." Evelyn's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced Madeline instantly. "I've spent so long trying to pretending to be happy, pretending to be someone I'm not. But with you," she hesitated, her eyes searching Madeline's face. "With you, I feel like I can finally be real." Madeline's heart ached at the raw honesty in Evelyn's words. She wanted to say something, to reach out and comfort her, but all she could do was stare, frozen in place by the magnitude of what had just happened. Before she could find the words, the shrill sound of a phone ringing cut through the moment like a knife. They both jumped, the spell between them broken as Evelyn glanced toward the counter where her phone buzzed insistently. "It's Richard," Evelyn said, her voice trembling as she picked up the phone. She looked at Madeline, panic flashing in her eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, taking a deep breath, Evelyn answered. "Hello," she said, her voice carefully controlled, though her hand trembled as she held the phone to her ear. Madeline watched as Evelyn's expression shifted, her shoulders tensing at whatever Richard was saying on the other end of the line. "What?" Evelyn said after a moment, her voice rising slightly in alarm. "No, of course. I'll see you soon." She hung up and turned to Madeline, her face pale. "His flight was cancelled. He's on his way back now." Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. "How soon?" "An hour, maybe less," Evelyn said, running a hand through her hair as she began pacing the kitchen. "He'll expect me to be here. If he finds you..." "I need to go," Madeline said, her voice sharp with urgency. She grabbed her coat, her movements frantic as the weight of what they had just done pressed down on her. Evelyn stopped her, grabbing her arm. Madeline, wait. Madeline turned to face her, her chest heaving with panic. Evelyn, I can't be here when he gets back. You know that. I know, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. I know, but, she hesitated, her grip on Madeline's arm tightening. This isn't the end, is it? Madeline's heart clenched at the desperation in Evelyn's voice. She reached up, cupping Evelyn's face with trembling hands. I don't know, she said honestly, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. I don't know what this is or what it means, but, it's not nothing. Evelyn closed her eyes, leaning into Madeline's touch for just a moment before stepping back. Go, she said softly, her voice barely audible. I'll handle Richard. Madeline nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She grabbed her things and made her way to the elevator, her legs unsteady beneath her. As the doors closed behind her, she pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The ride down felt endless, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her like a physical force. When she stepped out into the rain-soaked street, she gasped for air, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and longing. She hailed a cab, barely aware of the driver's questions as she gave him her address. As the city blurred past her, her mind raced. The kiss, the look in Evelyn's eyes, the way her touch had lingered as if neither of them could bear to let go. Madeline knew she had crossed a line and there was no going back. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, had already set something in motion that neither of them could stop. The storm outside mirrored the one inside her, a chaotic swirl of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. Fear, guilt, desire, hope, they all collided within her, leaving her breathless and trembling by the time she reached her apartment. As she collapsed onto her couch, the rain still hammering against the windows, one thought echoed in her mind, clear and inescapable. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were some of the longest of Madeline's life. He carried the memory of that kiss like a weight on her chest, heavy and unrelenting. It haunted her at all hours. When she woke in the middle of the night, the image of Evelyn's face still vivid in her mind. When she sat at her desk trying to focus on Richard's calendar but instead hearing Evelyn's voice in her head. And when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the way Evelyn's hand had lingered on hers as if silently asking her to stay. Guilt clawed at her constantly. Every time she passed Richard in the office, she felt like his sharp gray eyes might pierce straight through her, exposing everything. Her heart raced whenever he stopped by her desk, his voice brusque and clipped as he asked for updates. She became hyper-aware of every word she spoke, every glance she dared to cast in his direction, afraid that somehow he might sense what had happened. But guilt wasn't the only thing tormenting her. There was the desire too, the ache that refused to fade no matter how hard she tried to suppress it. She could still feel the ghost of Evelyn's lips on hers, the warmth of her touch, the way she had looked at her as if Madeline was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. And then there were the messages. The first one arrived the morning after the kiss, a simple text that made Madeline's breath catch. I hope you made it home safely. I haven't stopped thinking about last night. Madeline stared at her phone for what felt like hours, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she debated whether to respond. Eventually she typed out a brief reply. I'm fine. I think we should talk about what happened. But Evelyn didn't wait for the office or a planned meeting to continue the conversation. She replied almost immediately. I can't stop thinking about you, Madeline. I don't know what to do. Madeline's heart raced as she read the words, her guilt and desire clashing violently. She told herself she needed to end this before it spiraled further out of control. But when she tried to craft a message to that effect, her fingers refused to type the words. Instead she simply stared at the screen, her emotions a tangled mess. The texts didn't stop. Over the next few days, Evelyn's messages became bolder, more direct. I need to see you. This can't be a mistake. Not when it feels like this. Madeline tried to resist. She told herself to ignore the messages, to put distance between them, but each time her phone buzzed, she couldn't help the way her heart leapt. Evelyn's words were like a lifeline, pulling her back into that moment they had shared. A moment that had felt more real, more alive than anything in her carefully controlled life. At work, Madeline threw herself into her tasks with a manic determination, hoping to distract herself. She avoided Richard as much as possible, dreading every interaction. Even small moments like handing him a file or updating him on his schedule felt like walking a tightrope. She couldn't shake the fear that he might somehow know what was happening, that he would see the guilt etched across her face and piece it all together. But Evelyn's persistence made it impossible to escape. One afternoon, as Madeline sat at her desk, staring blankly at an email she was supposed to be drafting, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and froze. "I'm at the cafe across the street. Please just come talk to me." Madeline's heart pounded. She knew she should ignore it, should pretend she hadn't seen it, but the thought of Evelyn sitting there waiting for her was too much. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and slipped out of the office. The rain had stopped, leaving the city damp and cool as she crossed the street to the small cafe. Her nerves were frayed, her steps hesitant, but when she stepped inside and saw Evelyn sitting at a corner table, all her doubts seemed to evaporate. Evelyn looked up as the bell over the door chimed, and when their eyes met, Madeline felt her breath catch. Evelyn wasn't the polished, composed woman she had seen so many times before. She looked vulnerable, almost fragile, her hair pulled back loosely and her face free of makeup. But there was something in her gaze, an intensity, a longing, that made Madeline's heart ache. Madeline hesitated, her instinct to flee battling with the pull she felt toward Evelyn. But Evelyn smiled softly, her eyes pleading, and before she knew it, Madeline was walking toward the table. "Hi," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but steady. "Hi," Madeline replied, sliding into the seat across from her. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to still their trembling. "You shouldn't have asked me to come here." "I know," Evelyn said, her eyes searching Madeline's face. "But I couldn't help myself." Madeline looked down, her chest tightening. "This is dangerous, Evelyn. You know that." "I don't care," Evelyn said firmly. "I can't pretend like nothing happened. Can you?" Madeline didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was written all over her face, in the way her hands fidgeted, in the way her pulse raced every time Evelyn spoke. "I feel like I've been asleep for years," Evelyn continued, her voice breaking slightly. "And then you came along and suddenly, I'm awake. I don't know how to ignore that." Madeline closed her eyes, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Evelyn, if Richard finds out—" "Let me worry about Richard," Evelyn interrupted. She leaned forward, her hand brushing against Madeline's on the table. "This is about us. What do you want, Madeline?" Madeline's resolve crumbled under the weight of Evelyn's words. She looked up, her eyes meeting Evelyn's, and for the first time she let herself admit the truth. "I want you," she whispered. "But I'm terrified." Evelyn's eyes softened and she reached across the table, taking Madeline's hand in hers. "So am I. But I'd rather be terrified with you than keep living a lie." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Madeline knew she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't fully understand, something that could change everything. But as she looked into Evelyn's eyes, she realized she didn't want to turn back. Not anymore. The clandestine nature of their meetings only seemed to heighten the intensity of their connection. Each stolen moment between Madeline and Evelyn felt like a spark against the darkness of their respective lives. They chose quiet, out-of-the-way cafes, the kind where no one would recognize Evelyn as the wife of Richard Armitage, or dimly lit hotel rooms where the outside world couldn't reach them. Those hours together were electric, charged with emotions too strong to contain. For Evelyn, these meetings became her lifeline. With every conversation she opened up more, revealing the fractured reality of her life behind the glossy veneer. "Richard doesn't love me," Evelyn admitted one night as they sat across from each other in a small, rustic cafe tucked into a quiet corner of Brooklyn. She stirred her tea absently, her gaze distant. "I don't think he ever did. I was convenient. The right look, the right family connections. We were perfect on paper, and that was all he cared about." Madeline watched her carefully, her heart aching at the vulnerability in Evelyn's voice. "You deserve more than that," she said softly. Evelyn met her gaze, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't know how much I was missing until I met you." The words struck Madeline like a lightning bolt. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing Evelyn's. It was a small gesture, but it carried all the unspoken feelings that neither of them could put into words. As their relationship deepened, Evelyn began to share more of Richard's secrets. She spoke of his indifference to her, his infidelities that he didn't even bother to hide, and the ruthless way he conducted his business. "He destroys people," Evelyn said one evening, her voice trembling as she sat on the edge of a hotel bed. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders in soft waves, and her eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "Not just professionally. He goes after their families, their reputations. If someone crosses him, he makes sure they regret it for the rest of their lives." Madeline sat beside her, her hand resting on Evelyn's knee in a gesture of comfort. "Why do you stay?" she asked, though the answer seemed painfully clear. "Because leaving isn't as simple as it sounds," Evelyn replied, her voice bitter. "He has connections everywhere. Lawyers, private investigators, people who owe him favors. If I leave, he'll ruin me." Madeline's jaw tightened, her anger at Richard growing with every word Evelyn spoke. "You don't deserve to live in fear," she said, her voice firm. "There has to be a way out." Evelyn looked at her, tears welling in her eyes. "You're the only thing that gives me hope, Madeline. When I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe again." Those words became the anchor for their secret relationship, the thing that kept them both coming back despite the risks. But the danger was always there, lurking in the shadows. Richard wasn't a man who missed details, and it wasn't long before he began to notice the subtle changes in Evelyn's behavior. She was more distant, more guarded. She took more trips into the city, staying out later than usual. At first, he dismissed it as boredom or an attempt to assert some form of independence. But as the weeks went on, his suspicions grew. He began asking pointed questions during their rare conversations, his tone sharp and loaded with implication. "Where were you today?" he asked one evening as Evelyn returned from a meeting with Madeline. Evelyn's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "I went shopping," she said smoothly. "I needed some air." Richard didn't respond immediately, his cold gray eyes studying her. "Next time let me know. It's not safe to be out alone." Evelyn nodded, forcing a polite smile, but inside she felt a wave of dread. She knew Richard well enough to recognize when his mind was working through something. Her fears were confirmed when, a few days later, she spotted a car parked near the cafe where she and Madeline often met. It wasn't the kind of place that usually attracted expensive black sedans, and the man inside was too nondescript to be there by coincidence. Evelyn felt her blood run cold. She told Madeline about it that night, her voice trembling as they sat together in a hotel room. "I think he's watching me," she said, clutching Madeline's hand. Madeline's stomach twisted. "Do you think he knows?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet. But if he suspects something, he won't stop until he finds out." The tension followed Madeline everywhere. At the office, she threw herself into her work with a fervor that bordered on frantic, desperate to maintain the facade of normalcy. But it was clear her colleagues had noticed a change. "Are you okay, Maddie?" one of her co-workers, a junior associate named Claire, asked one afternoon. "You've seemed distracted lately." "I'm fine," Madeline replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my plate." But the whispers were impossible to ignore. People in the office were talking, speculating about her sudden shift in behavior. Some chalked it up to stress, others to an imagined romance, but Madeline knew how dangerous it was for anyone to notice her at all. And then there was Richard. Every time she passed him in the hall, every time he glanced at her during a meeting, she felt a stab of fear. His gaze seemed sharper, more probing, as if he were searching for a crack in her composure. The pressure was suffocating, but even in the midst of it, Madeline couldn't bring herself to stay away from Evelyn. Each time she received a text, each time Evelyn asked to see her, she couldn't say no. "I can't lose you," Evelyn whispered one night, her voice thick with emotion as they lay tangled together in a bed that wasn't theirs. "You're the only thing keeping me sane." Madeline pressed a kiss to Evelyn's temple, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. "You won't lose me," she promised, even as a voice in the back of her mind reminded her how fragile their world had become. The danger was real and it was closing in around them. But neither of them could stop, not now, not when they had come this far. The tension was unbearable from the moment the invitation came. Richard had summoned Evelyn and Madeline for a dinner at the penthouse, the message delivered with a formality that felt almost sinister. "For your hard work," he'd said in passing, his tone clipped as he informed Madeline at the office. "Evelyn insisted you come. 7 o'clock sharp." Madeline's stomach twisted. The invitation felt less like a gesture of gratitude and more like a test, though of what she wasn't entirely sure. When she locked eyes with Evelyn later that day, The flicker of fear in her expression confirmed what Madeline already suspected. This dinner would be anything but ordinary. When the evening arrived, Madeline stood outside the penthouse door, her nerves fraying. She smoothed the fabric of her dress for the third time, a simple black number that she'd agonized over for hours. Too formal and it would draw attention. Too casual and Richard might take offense. The balance had to be perfect even if her pulse was anything but. The door opened and Evelyn greeted her. She was stunning as always, her emerald green dress flowing elegantly, but there was a tension in her eyes that betrayed her calm exterior. "Madeline," Evelyn said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Thank you for coming." Madeline forced a smile. "I didn't think I had much of a choice." Evelyn's lips curved into a faint, fleeting smile, but her eyes darted toward the dining room. "He's already waiting. Be careful." Madeline nodded, her chest tightening as she stepped inside. The penthouse was as pristine and cold as ever, the faint scent of polish lingering in the air. Richard was seated at the head of the table, his posture straight, his gaze sharp as he rose to greet her. "Madeline," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I'm glad you could join us." "Thank you for having me," Madeline replied, keeping her tone even despite the anxiety clawing at her. They took their seats, Evelyn settling across from Madeline while Richard, of course, occupied the head of the table. The setup felt deliberate, as though he wanted to ensure there was no escape from his watchful gaze. The dinner began in strained silence, the clinking of silverware against plates the only sound for several minutes. Madeline kept her eyes on her food, her appetite non-existent but her hand steady as she forced herself to eat. Across the table, Evelyn barely touched her meal, her fingers toying with the stem of her wine glass. "So," Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it that made Madeline's shoulders tense. "How has the office been treating you, Madeline?" "It's been challenging but rewarding," she replied carefully, keeping her voice polite. "Challenging," Richard repeated as though savoring the word. He leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on her. "I hope that means you're keeping focused. Distractions can be dangerous in our line of work." Madeline's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. "I understand that, Mr. Armitage. I take my responsibilities very seriously." Richard's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the weight of it like a physical pressure. Finally, he shifted his attention to Evelyn. "And what about you, Evelyn? You've been spending quite a bit of time in the city lately." Evelyn froze, her fingers tightening around her glass. "I enjoy getting out," she said smoothly, though her voice was a touch too bright. "It's nice to have a change of scenery." Richard raised an eyebrow. "A change of scenery," he echoed. "Interesting. I was under the impression you found the city overwhelming." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "I suppose I've learned to appreciate it." Madeline felt her pulse quicken, her heart pounding in her chest as Richard's words hung in the air. His tone was light, conversational even, but the undercurrent of suspicion was impossible to ignore. She glanced at Evelyn, her chest tightening at the tension she saw in her posture, the way her shoulders seemed too stiff, her smile too forced. The rest of the dinner was a balancing act. Every word and gesture weighed against the possibility of discovery. Richard alternated between pointed questions and idle conversation, his sharp eyes flicking between Madeline and Evelyn like a predator studying its prey. At one point he turned his attention back to Madeline. "You've done excellent work lately," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "I've noticed you've been staying late at the office quite often. Dedication like that is rare these days." Madeline forced a smile, though her chest felt like it was caving in. "Thank you. I try to be thorough." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Thoroughness is important. It ensures clarity." The words were simple, but the way he said them made the hair on the back of Madeline's neck stand on end. Evelyn broke the tension, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Madeline's work has been invaluable to you, Richard. I hope you appreciate how much she contributes to your success." Richard turned to Evelyn, his lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I appreciate it," he said smoothly. "I appreciate everything that's happening around me." Madeline's breath caught, her hand tightening around her fork. She didn't dare look at Evelyn, afraid of what her expression might reveal. The evening dragged on, each moment stretching into an eternity. When the final course was cleared and the wine glasses were emptied, Richard rose from the table, his movements deliberate. "Thank you both for an enlightening evening," he said, his tone polite but laced with something darker. "It's always good to catch up." Madeline murmured her thanks, relief flooding her as she stood to leave. Evelyn walked her to the door, her hand brushing against Madeline's arm as they stood in the entryway. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not your fault," Madeline replied softly, her eyes searching Evelyn's. "But we need to be careful." Evelyn nodded, her expression filled with fear and something deeper, something that looked a lot like regret. Madeline stepped into the elevator, her chest tight as the doors closed. She leaned against the wall, her heart pounding in her ears. She had survived the evening, but she knew Richard wasn't finished. The way he had watched her, the subtle barbs in his words. He was circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The storm finally broke one crisp, clear evening when Richard walked into the penthouse, a folder clutched tightly in his hand and fury etched across his face. Evelyn was seated on the sofa in the living room, a book open in her lap, but the moment she heard the door slam, her body tensed. She didn't look up immediately, hoping she could buy herself a few seconds of composure before facing whatever mood he had brought home this time. "Evelyn," Richard said, his voice cold and sharp. She looked up, startled by the unfamiliar edge in his tone. Her heart sank when she saw the expression on his face, an icy mask of control barely concealing the rage simmering beneath. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the book aside. He walked to the coffee table, dropping the folder onto it with a deliberate thud. The papers inside spilled out slightly, and Evelyn's blood ran cold when she caught a glimpse of the photos. The first image was unmistakable. Her and Madeline seated at a corner table in a quiet cafe, their heads leaning toward each other, their hands almost touching. Another showed them entering a hotel together, the camera angle invasive and unforgiving. Evelyn's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She reached for the folder, but Richard's hand shot out, slamming it shut before she could grab it. "Explain this," he said, his voice dangerously low. She swallowed hard, her mind racing for something to say, but the truth hung heavy between them, undeniable. "It's not what you think," she began, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. Richard let out a bitter laugh, the sound chilling in its emptiness. "Not what I think. Do you take me for a fool, Evelyn? You've been sneaking around with her, haven't you?" Evelyn's silence was all the confirmation he needed. Richard's eyes narrowed, his voice rising as his anger boiled over. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've made me look like a damn fool. My wife, sneaking around with my employee like some cheap soap opera scandal." Evelyn's fear gave way to anger, her own frustration rising to the surface. She stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "You don't get to talk to me like that, Richard," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You don't get to act like this is all my fault." Richard's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. "Is that so? You think you're the victim here? Do you have any idea what this could do to me? To my reputation? You've jeopardized everything. My career, my image. Because you couldn't control yourself." Evelyn stepped closer, her anger flaring. "Your reputation? That's all you ever care about, isn't it? How things look to the outside world. You don't give a damn about me or how I feel. This marriage has been a lie for years and you know it." Richard's lip curled in disdain. "Don't play the martyr, Evelyn. You knew exactly what you were getting into when you married me." "No," Evelyn shot back, her voice rising. "I knew what you wanted me to believe. But I didn't sign up to be a prisoner in my own home, to live under your constant control and manipulation." Richard's expression twisted into a sneer. "Don't flatter yourself. You're nothing without me. You'd still be playing hostess at charity events if I hadn't pulled you into this life." Evelyn's hands shook, but she refused to back down. "I'd rather be hosting charity events than living like this, Richard. I'm done pretending, done living for your approval. I want out." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. For the first time, Richard looked genuinely taken aback. But his surprise quickly gave way to fury, and he took a step closer, towering over her. "You want out," he hissed. "Fine. But let me make one thing clear. If you think you can walk away from this unscathed, you're delusional. I'll destroy her." Evelyn froze, her heart dropping. "Madeline." "Yes," Richard said, his voice venomous. You think I'll let her walk away from this after what you've done? I'll ruin her career. She'll never work in this city again. And you'll lose everything, your friends, your name, your family's respect. You'll be a pariah. Tears burned at the corners of Evelyn's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. You're a monster, she whispered. Richard smiled coldly. And you're a fool if you think I won't follow through. No. Or you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Evelyn didn't answer, her mind racing as she tried to process the weight of his threat. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, shaking and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. She collapsed onto the sofa, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Madeline's number. It rang once, twice, and then Madeline's voice came through, warm and familiar. Evelyn. Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks as she whispered, "We're in trouble." The words were both a plea and a confession, and Evelyn knew that from this moment forward, nothing would ever be the same. For Madeline, the threat from Richard was like a blade hanging over her head, sharp and unrelenting. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her modest apartment, her thoughts churning endlessly. She loved Evelyn in a way she hadn't thought herself capable of loving anyone, but Richard's words echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. I'll destroy her. I'll destroy you both. The fear was suffocating. Madeline had worked tirelessly to build her career, carving out a place for herself in a city that chewed people up and spit them out without a second thought. Losing everything, her job, her reputation, her future, was a terrifying prospect. But as she pictured Evelyn's face, her courage in standing up to Richard, her unwavering belief in their love, Madeline knew the real question wasn't whether she could risk everything for Evelyn. It was whether she could live with herself if she didn't. The answer came one rainy evening when Evelyn showed up at Madeline's apartment unannounced. Her hair was damp, her coat dripping with rainwater, but her eyes burned with determination. I'm done being afraid, Evelyn said, stepping into the warmth of Madeline's living room. We have to fight back. Madeline blinked, startled by the raw intensity in Evelyn's voice. Evelyn, he's a bully, Evelyn interrupted, her voice steady but firm. And bullies thrive on fear. I won't give him that power anymore. Madeline hesitated, her own fear still tugging at her, but Evelyn stepped closer, taking her hands. Madeline, we can do this. I know we can. He's not invincible. It was the first time Madeline had seen Evelyn like this. Fierce, resolute, unyielding. She had always thought of Evelyn as soft, trapped, needing protection. But now she saw something else entirely. Evelyn wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for them, for their chance to be free. What's your plan? Madeline asked, her voice trembling slightly but filled with a spark of hope. Evelyn let out a breath, her hands tightening around Madeline's. Richard has skeletons in his closet. I've seen them. Financial records, business deals, things that could ruin him if they ever saw the light of day. He keeps everything locked away in his office, but I know where to look. Madeline's stomach twisted. The idea of going up against Richard, a man who seemed untouchable, was daunting. But as she looked into Evelyn's eyes, she felt her fear begin to melt away, replaced by a steely resolve. Tell me what you need, Madeline said. Over the next several days they worked in secret, meeting in the dead of night to go over their plan. Evelyn would use her knowledge of Richard's habits to gain access to his files, while Madeline would leverage her connections at the firm to piece together a damning case. The risks were immense, but the stakes were even higher. Evelyn was a natural at uncovering Richard's secrets. Years of being dismissed and underestimated had given her a unique advantage. She had observed him closely, cataloging the small details he thought were insignificant. She knew the combination to his office safe, the password to his private server, the locked drawer where he kept handwritten notes from meetings he didn't trust to record electronically. One night, after Richard had left for an overnight business trip, Evelyn made her move. With trembling hands, she opened the safe in his home office, her heart pounding as she retrieved a thick folder of documents. Each page was more damning than the last. Offshore accounts, fraudulent contracts, evidence of insider trading. Her fingers trembled as she photographed each document, her breath hitching every time she heard the creak of the house settling, terrified it might be Richard returning early. When she handed the photos to Madeline the next day, they both stared at the evidence in stunned silence. This is enough to destroy him, Madeline said, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded, but her expression was grim. It's not just about destroying him. It's about making sure he can never hurt anyone else again. Madeline reached across the table, taking Evelyn's hand. We'll do it together. The first step was contacting an investigative journalist, someone outside the firm who could publish the story without fear of corporate influence. Evelyn had read about a woman named Clara Hart, a reporter known for exposing corruption in high places. After a tense, coded email exchange, they met Clara in a small diner on the outskirts of the city. Clara was sharp, with piercing blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened intently as Evelyn and Madeline explained their situation, her expression growing darker with each revelation. If what you're telling me is true, Clara said, her voice steady but grave, this could bring Richard Armitage down. But it's going to get ugly. He's not the kind of man who goes down quietly. We're ready, Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. Clara nodded, pulling out a recorder. Then let's get started. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Clara verified the documents, cross-referencing them with public records and conducting interviews with former employees and business associates. Madeline fed her insider information from the firm, careful to cover her tracks while balancing the mounting pressure at work. Richard, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the storm brewing around him, though his temper grew more volatile. He barked orders at his staff with increasing aggression, his paranoia evident in the way he scrutinized everyone around him. Madeline had to fight to keep her composure every time he addressed her, her heart racing at the thought of what would happen if he discovered her betrayal. Then one morning the story broke. The front page of the city's most prominent newspaper bore the headline, "Titan of Industry or Criminal Mastermind. The Dark Secrets of Richard Armitage." The article laid out everything: his illegal dealings, his ruthless tactics, his financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, the photos of the documents Evelyn had provided staring back at him in black and white. Richard's reaction was explosive. He stormed into the office, his face red with fury, shouting at anyone who crossed his path. But the damage was done. Within hours, the board of directors convened an emergency meeting, and by the end of the day, Richard was forced to step down as CEO. The fallout was swift and brutal. Investigations were launched, accounts frozen, and Richard's name became synonymous with disgrace. He retreated to the shadows, his power and influence stripped away. Evelyn and Madeline watched the news unfold together, their hands intertwined as the weight of the past weeks finally lifted. "You did it," Madeline whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We did it," Evelyn corrected, her voice filled with quiet triumph. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt free. And as she looked at Madeline, she knew they had not only survived but found something worth fighting for. Together they had faced the storm and emerged stronger, their love unshaken and their future finally their own. The dust settled slowly as it often does after a storm, leaving Evelyn and Madeline to pick up the pieces of their lives. Richard was gone, his influence shattered by the scandal that had laid bare his corruption. His departure was not quiet. True to his nature, he had fought to the bitter end, threatening legal action, dragging Madeline's name through the mud in his fury. But the evidence against him was irrefutable. No matter how loudly he raged, his empire crumbled, leaving him a powerless shadow of the man he once was. For Evelyn, freedom felt like stepping into sunlight after years of darkness. She moved out of the penthouse immediately, leaving behind the marble floors and lifeless decor that had come to symbolize her imprisonment. The space had never truly been hers, and leaving it behind felt like shedding a second skin. Madeline was there every step of the way, her quiet strength and unwavering presence a source of comfort as Evelyn began the slow process of rebuilding her life. Together they found a modest but beautiful apartment in a quieter part of the city, with large windows that let in the morning light and a small balcony where Evelyn could grow flowers. It was nothing like the penthouse, and that was precisely the point. It was theirs. A space that felt alive, filled with laughter, warmth, and the intoxicating sense of possibility. But the scars of the past lingered. There were days when Evelyn couldn't shake the fear that Richard's shadow might return to haunt them. The years of control, of walking on eggshells, had left her with reflexes she struggled to unlearn. She flinched at unexpected phone calls, caught herself second-guessing every decision, and woke from restless dreams with her heart pounding. Madeline understood. Her own wounds were quieter but just as deep. The betrayal of Richard's threats and the weeks of living under constant scrutiny had taken their toll. At work, whispers followed her like a second shadow. Though she had left the firm shortly after the scandal broke, moving on to a smaller and more ethical company, the gossip from her time under Richard's thumb lingered in the corners of her memory. Their love became the salve for these wounds, a steady, healing force that neither of them had expected but both had come to depend on. They spent long evenings on their balcony, wrapped in blankets, sharing their fears and dreams in hushed voices as the city hummed softly below. Each confession brought them closer, every shared memory another thread woven into the fabric of their new life together. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Evelyn turned to Madeline, her expression soft but serious. "Do you think we'll ever really be free of him?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Madeline reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think freedom isn't about forgetting," she said thoughtfully. "It's about learning how to live with what's happened. And we're already doing that." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes I feel like I don't even know who I am without him, without that weight on my shoulders." "You're discovering that every day," Madeline replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You're strong, Evelyn. Stronger than you realize." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling at the conviction in Madeline's voice. She leaned into her, resting her head on Madeline's shoulder as they watched the sun disappear behind the skyline. The road ahead wasn't always smooth. Evelyn started seeing a therapist, working through the trauma of her years with Richard and the complicated emotions that came with leaving him behind. Madeline threw herself into her new job, finding purpose in work that aligned with her values. Together they learned to navigate the challenges of their new lives, their bond growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. As the months passed, their lives began to take shape in ways neither of them had anticipated. Evelyn rediscovered her love for art, something she had buried under the weight of Richard's expectations. She started painting again, her small studio filling with vibrant canvases that seemed to mirror her newfound freedom. Madeline encouraged her every step of the way, marveling at the light in Evelyn's eyes whenever she spoke about her work. Madeline, in turn, found herself inspired by Evelyn's courage. She took risks she never would have considered before, joining a mentorship program for young women in business, volunteering at a nonprofit that supported whistleblowers, and finally allowing herself to believe she could make a difference. Their love flourished in the quiet, everyday moments that had once seemed unattainable. Cooking dinner together in their tiny kitchen, laughing over spilled wine and experimental recipes, dancing barefoot in the living room to old jazz records, their movements slow and unhurried. Whispering "I love you" in the dark, their words carrying the weight of everything they had endured. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony, Evelyn turned to Madeline, her gaze steady. "I never thought I'd find this," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "Not just freedom but this kind of love." Madeline smiled, her fingers brushing a strand of hair from Evelyn's face. "Neither did I. But I'm not letting it go." They kissed then, their connection deep and unshakable, a testament to the strength they had found in each other. In that moment, the ghosts of the past seemed to fade, leaving only the promise of the future. Their journey had been painful, their scars a reminder of the battles they had fought. But they had found something that made every step worth it. A love that was real, a life that was theirs, and a freedom that could never be taken away.